into almost every language on the face of the earth. It's sold more books, more copies than any other book by far, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, and the second place is the Guinness Book of World Records book. Jesus is undoubtedly the most important figure who has lived. He never told us to be ourselves. He never told us to get our own life. He never told us to mature into what we should be. He told us rather to follow him, to love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength. That our life comes from him, not from within ourselves. Jeremy, could you turn me down just a little bit? I hear myself too much and it's bothering me. Thank you. He said, rather, take up your cross, follow me. He didn't say seek your own destiny, your own fame, your own fortune. He said seek somebody else's fame, seek somebody else's glory. Glorify the Father in heaven. Love your neighbor as yourself. Who else said that in history? It was Jesus. It was his idea. And yet sometimes I think we don't know who this Jesus is. Sometimes I think we look at him and we don't recognize him. And so Mark chapter 6 is a chapter in the Gospels on recognizing Jesus. You remember he came to his hometown, did miracles. His own people didn't really understand who he was. This is Joseph's son and Mary's son. What's he doing miracles? And they didn't recognize him. The disciples went out into the village. They performed miracles. Herod, in the same chapter, saw John the Baptist. Couldn't stand John the Baptist. He recognized Herod, the sinner, recognized John. He had him killed, murdered. And then you know what he thought? That Jesus was the ghost of John the Baptist. He knew he was a problem, but he was afraid of him. He didn't recognize him for who he was. The crowds came to Jesus in the chapters we picked up last week. They gathered around him because why? They recognized the disciples, the crowds, the villagers, the common people. They came and they flocked to Jesus because they knew him for who he was. At the feeding of the 5,000. Remember that? They took the little fish, not the big fish, but the little fish, the little kippered herring, only for the Sea of Galilee version. Little fish, not big fish. Gave them rye crackers. These are just as bad. These are unsalted saltines. They recreated the Passover on the green grass of the fields to remind them that God had created a new people. They sat them down by 50s and 100s to recreate the memory of the original Passover. He came to say, I'm the new Moses. I'm coming to save my people, to rescue them. And he offered them effectively the recreation of the Passover meal that day. It was the Passover, after all, because it was the green grass. And John tells us as much, that it was the Passover was near. And everybody's hearts and minds were focused on that. But did we know who Jesus was after all that? The disciples, you'd think, would, wouldn't you? Yes, they sure would. But they didn't. And we're going to ask the question, do we recognize this Jesus? It's a chapter about recognition. Point number 1 in the text that we read, because Jesus invited you out for a quiet day in the wilderness, doesn't mean you'll get any rest. You remember how it was? The disciples came back. They were exhausted. People were coming and going so much. Remember the puzzle part? We shook it and somebody threw it out all over the floor. It was a terribly busy day. And the disciples at the end of the day, they had it. They wanted everybody to go home and leave and go somewhere else because they thought they deserved some rest. So Jesus said, let's go out in the wilderness. We'll have a rest. You want rest? I'll show you what rest is. He took them out there and what happened? 5,000 of their closest friends showed up, and they had a dinner for them. Now, I tell you what, that's a lot of work. Because just because Jesus invites you out for a quiet getaway doesn't mean you're going to get it. Jesus, after this, when it's all said and done, he compelled his disciples to get into the boat. And you can read along in your text there in the Bible, because I want to refer to it. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida. He didn't ask them, he didn't invite them. He said, you have to do this. He compelled them. The Greek word is henekesen. He compelled them to get into the boat. Why compelled? Because he promised them a day of rest. He promised them that at the end of the day they would have time together and be quiet. And they didn't have a quiet moment all day. With 5,000 friends, Jesus taught. It was a working day. And now it's a working night. They fed 5,000 and Jesus says, go into the boat. So they started rowing. He said, go to the other side. You see, Jesus never promised his disciples that it was going to be smooth sailing. He told them it was going to be hard work. They're going to have a cross. That's the real Jesus. The real Jesus doesn't make everything easy and smooth. He sometimes makes it hard. He never goes out of his way to help his disciples beyond what's the absolute minimum. No food, no rest, and now they have to row all night long. They didn't want to go, and I can understand that. You see, Jesus had things to do and places to go, and they were going with him. There was a man named Dick Hoyt. He had a son who was injured at birth. The son couldn't do anything but sit in a wheelchair, but he could communicate after a while. They made an electronic gizmo that would help him communicate. One day his son at age 20 said, I want to run. Well, his son can't run because he was in a wheelchair. Barely could speak. But Dick decided he could push his son in the wheelchair, and he decided to run a marathon. So Dick ran marathons with his son. His son was delighted. He decided to run a triathlon. He did the bicycling. He did the swimming. He towed his son in a boat and a rope, as I recall it. He bicycled with him. He pushed his wheelchair and ran 26 miles. People like me couldn't run near that far. But he did, and he came within a half hour of the fast speeds. You know, God doesn't ever say you get a chance to set aside all your responsibilities. This is the Father who loved his Son, and he was compelled, that's the word we're looking at here, he compelled them by love to push the boy to care for his disciples, to row ahead because he has things to do. God can create the world to run perfectly, you think. Why do God's people always have to go out at night? I mean, come on. All night long they're going to row across. Couldn't have Jesus arranged this to happen in the day? I mean, he's God. But Jesus never made it easy for his disciples. Number two, just because Jesus promised you a retreat, just because they worked all day with the crowds and they were trying to escape, there's no guarantee that you won't work all night. He went up to the mountain to pray. And they got in the boat and rowed. We like to think that Jesus goes up to pray, and that's a good thing, and it's a sweet thing, but it's not always a good thing and a sweet thing when Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray, because Moses went up to Mount Horeb, and then he had to do things he didn't want to do. Elijah went into the mountain, and it wasn't all that happy for him either. He was troubled, and he was distressed. Jesus went into the mountain to pray, and he was crucified the next day. Just because you've come for a place of rest won't mean that you won't work all night and work hard. Remember last week we talked about James Dobson. His father had a vision that James Dobson would become a speaker, that he had a radio show. And the first thing, they had prayed and prayed, and they knew that God had answered their prayer. And so the first thing that happened on his launch night, the day before his launch, remember what happened? He went to the Donahue show, and Donahue humiliated him on public television. You see, there's no guarantee that when God prays for you and answers your prayer that you're going to like the answer. They were forced into the boat and they rowed all night long. Number three, I told you I'm going fast. Just because Jesus promised a quiet time in the wilderness and the crowd shows up to spoil it, just because you worked all day and you fed 5,000 people and now you have to work all night, there's no guarantee that you won't be alone at the end of the day. You see, Jesus was on the mountain praying, and where were they? In the boat. What did they come out to do? Be with Jesus. And where was Jesus? He was alone on the land. When the evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. I was a kayaker for a while, and I would paddle across large bodies of open water, like from Seaback to Brennan over there. It doesn't look so far when you're on the shore, but when you're in the middle, it's a different place, because little animals come up and visit you, and they make noises behind you. And you turn around, and all you see is a swirl where they used to be. There's sea lions and seals and birds and submarine, who knows. was out one time, that's the truth. They were doing the deep sea testing out there, and I turned around and looked at me. There's 6 boats coming at me. And one of them was a submarine. And, oh, God, help me. I can't swim that fast. There's no guarantee that you won't be alone and it won't be frightening. When they're out there, they say, if only Jesus were with me, he'd talk to me, he'd explain to me, and he'd tell me. I wouldn't be alone then. But he didn't come talk to them that night. He left them alone all night long. Didn't explain what was happening next. Number 4, just because Jesus promised a quiet time with him alone in a quiet place, just because a crowd of 5,000 people comes along and spoils your vacation with Jesus, and just because he forced you in the boat and row all the way home in the middle of the night all alone, there's no guarantee that the wind won't be against you on the way home. You know, Jesus could have arranged the wind to go any way he wanted. Could have had the wind blow with him. You know, could have. The Irish have a blessing that hangs in our house, and it says, may the road rise to meet you, and the wind be at your back. May the sun shine softly on your face. May rain fall softly upon your fields until we meet again. May God hold you in the palm of his hand. Isn't that beautiful? May the road rise to meet you, the wind be at your back, pushing you along, easing you along your way. The Navy has a blessing. They call it fair winds and following sea, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Good deal. That means may your sailing be smooth and you won't capsize in the sea. Jesus had his own version of this. It'll be night. It'll be dark. The wind will come up. It'll be against you. The waves will crash over the bow. You'll be wet by the time you get to where you're going, and you'll be alone. You'll row hard against the wind. I'll blow you off course so that you're going to one town, but you'll end up at another town on the other side of the sea, and you won't know what tire it is until you get to the other side. It wasn't fair winds and following seas. If you want to know Jesus, you have to know that he doesn't rescue people immediately. He doesn't rescue them every time. Daniel is one, Paul's another, Joseph is another. Spent a long time in jail. Esther didn't have such a good time either. And poor Ruth nearly starves to death while God's waiting to take care of her. I had a friend. He had a lung transplant at UW. Top surgeon, one of the top surgeons in the world performed it. Had the surgery, and at the end of the day, you know, those things are, you have to go when you can go. And I'd been up all day. The wife called me up, could I go? So I went over there at midnight, spent all night waiting with her and the family. Comes out of surgery in the morning, I came home exhausted. Fell asleep about 3.5 minutes. The phone rang and the surgery didn't go so well. Can I come back? Spent the next day there, and you think, why doesn't God make this right? Sometimes the wind blows the wrong way. I sat there in the room, and the doctor came out. He was devastated. And he just fell into my arms. And I prayed for him. God help this man. Because he lost the patient too. I don't know why God gives us winds that are in our face. But I can tell you something, it's not always easy when Jesus goes up into the mountains to pray. Because sometimes the wind of the world is against you and you'll row all night long. And at the end of the day, you're still rowing. Number 5, just because you didn't get the quiet getaway that Jesus promised, you worked all day and you weren't taking care of 5,000 people, you rowed all night long with the headwinds. And you went off course. There's no guarantee that Jesus is going to hurry up and come take care of you. Sometimes we pray and we think, oh God, I pray, now you need to fix this right away. You know what? Jesus saw his disciples, verse 48. Still reading along with me, I hope, right? Verse 48. He saw them straining at the oars. See that word? Think they're having a good time? This is a boating adventure. Matthew and the boys go boating? No. They're working hard all night long because the wind's blowing hard. And it was against them. It was the 4th watch of the night before he got around to getting to them. 4th watch of the night means about 3 in the morning. So they have left at after twilight, and they've rowed for a good 6 hours, at least. And now Jesus comes to him. He could have prayed a little shorter, but he didn't. You see, Jesus isn't in a hurry to solve my problems. He solves things on his time. State Farm has a little advertising that says State Farm's there. Meaning, if you have a wreck, you got the picture that State Farm's just standing right there on the corner, just waiting to come over and wrench out a $10,000 check and everything will be fine. You know? And farmers, they know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two. And if you have trouble, you call farmers and that insurance company, they've got it all figured out. Everything is good. Right? Jesus didn't subscribe to that philosophy of ministering and caring for his disciples. He left them out there and they were straining all night long. Hagar, strange, nearly died in the desert before Jesus sent an angel to take care of her. Abraham and Isaac, you know that story. Isaac nearly died waiting for the angel to show up. William Carey, a great missionary to India, famous man, devoted 41 years of his life to bringing the gospel to the Hindu people of India. He was known everywhere. He had to raise his own money, do his own supporting, did the whole thing. He worked hard in those days. It was a sailing ship. It was about before 1800, about in that era. It was a tough life. He was going to be the only English-speaking person in many of these regions. After 41 years, do you want to take a guess how many converts he had? He and his whole team, how many? Want to guess? I didn't think so. Good choice. 700. His whole life, out of this continent of a billion, how many people? 700. His impact was zero, almost, statistically. But if you had asked today who changed the course of history, it would have been William Carey. Colleges named after him, universities, lives changed because of what he did in those days. You see, God doesn't show up the day I ask for help. God shows up when he wants to. The real Jesus knows his own time. He saw him straining. He saw William Carey. He sees you and he sees me, and he shows up when he's ready. Number 5. I'm looking at the clock, and the big hand's on the 5. I'm going as fast as I can. You still okay? Yeah. All right. I'm still here. You're still here. I'm still here too. Just because you didn't get what you wanted, Jesus promised you worked all day and 5,000 people showed up and you're working all night, you're all alone and the wind is against you, it doesn't mean that he will come in a hurry and will come to you. Because it says that Jesus was about to pass them by when he got there. Can you imagine that? Row, 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 water splashing. They've got a committee. It was a Methodist boat, they'd have a committee. And 3 of the disciples would be appointed to bail, 4 would be rowing, and 2 would be making a potluck. Jesus came, and he was about to walk them by. How could he do that? After all those hours. Maybe you've had that same experience. You say, God, come help me, I need help now. And everybody else gets what they want. And there you are. He doesn't always tell you his plans. You say, if only Jesus was here or here, he would tell me. And I'm telling you, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll walk by. But for some way or another, they stop him. And they got his attention. Number 6, just because you didn't get quite get away with Jesus, and just because you spent the day caring for 5,000, he left you alone, and he's praying on the hill, and you've been clobbered by the wind, and everything seems to have gone against you, doesn't mean that you also won't be scared to death in the process. That's right. The wind is against you. If you lived in the ancient world, you would know that the word wind and the word spirit are the same word. They're indistinguishable words. If you're Hebrew, it's spelled R-U-A-H, and if you're Greek, it's spelled P-N-E-U-M-A. And if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you'll see pneumatic, P-N-E-U-M-A-T-I-C, pneumatic. It means wind. It's the same word as our word spirit. The pneumatic tool just runs on air. The wind, if you're an ancient person, is a spirit. and it blows against you. And they had this inkling that the Spirit of God blows like the wind, like you find in John chapter 3. It was blowing against them. And it was difficult to row. It had a feeling of a spiritual sense to it. And they prayed because they were nervous. They saw him walking on the lake, and they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out because they saw him, and they were terrified. Just because you've been walking with Jesus for a long time doesn't mean you won't be totally confused by what you see. They were. They just left Jesus a couple hours ago. They didn't even remember this about recognizing? They didn't recognize him. Right next to him. Didn't see him. And they were terrified. They cried out, "Help us." I was in my kayak, one of my other bad adventures. I kayaked from Port Townsend to Whidbey Island. It's quite a ways across there, across the shipping lane, and nobody in his right mind would do that. But I didn't know any better. And my wife wasn't there to tell me I shouldn't. So I did. I got out in the middle. It was a beautiful day. It was calm and flat, and I looked right and looked left. No big ships were coming, so I thought I'd be safe. Wasn't really a good idea. Don't ever do this. But I got all the way to the other shore, and I thought, wow, that's great. And then I didn't realize that the tide was coming out of the Puget Sound, and when it comes north, it hits against Whidbey Island. There's a little angle there, and it caroms off the south edge of Whidbey Island, and it is full of whirlpools and rips and twists and waves. And I was stuck, and I couldn't get through it, and all of a sudden I was washing out to Vancouver Island. And a 4-mile-an-hour tide is a lot faster than a 2-mile-an-hour preacher. And I cried out, "God, help me." And you know what? He didn't. I was terrified. Never did that again. Sold my kayak. Just because you don't get a quiet, number 7 now. Get the quiet getaway. Jesus is praying for you. You're getting clobbered on the lake. He's not in a hurry to come get you. And you're out in the middle of the night, and then for no reason he comes by and you don't recognize him. And I want to talk about the word recognize today. They don't recognize him. Why not? He's a ghost. Why is that? Because they don't see yet. Remember Herod? This is a pre-sermon about Herod. Sort of, a little bit. What did he think? Who did he think Jesus was? Thought he was a ghost, didn't he? Right? Thought he was a ghost of John the Baptist, come back to haunt him. These are pagans, right? That's what they believe. And so Jesus' disciples, and that's the point. They weren't any different from Herod. I just got to stop and think about that for a minute. The disciples were spiritually on the level with Herod. They are out there as friends, have been walking with him, doing all the things that they were supposed to do, but when they see him, they think something is wrong and that it is a ghost. See, we don't always recognize Jesus, and he's okay with that. I don't know why. I wish he would come announce himself to me. I wish he would let himself be known to me so I couldn't miss him. But he comes out there and you can't miss him. Just because you've been with Jesus don't mean you'll see him every time. Just because you could go for a quiet getaway and Jesus is praying for you, fed 5,000, you're tired, you worked all night, you row. It's all night long, you're alone, you're afraid the wind's against you, everything's wrong, your boat's wet, you're cold, you're tired, and you haven't had the rest that Jesus promised. After he explains it to you, what do you think happens next? You don't get it. You don't get it. And I'm not being mean, I'm not being unkind. I'm just telling you what the gospel says about Jesus, the Jesus that we need to recognize accurately. They thought he was a ghost. They cried out. They were all terrified. Immediately spoke to them, "Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid." He climbed in the boat with them, the wind died down, and now they were completely amazed. Why? That's the word that the gospel used to say somebody doesn't get it. They were just, duh. They'd seen the crackers and the fish. They'd seen the miracle. They'd been with Jesus for a year. They'd seen the healings. They'd seen everything else. They saw the miracle. They saw the sea calm down. And he says to them, "Don't worry, ego eimi." That's Greek for "it is I." He's copying God in Exodus. It's me. I'm your Lord. I'm your Savior. I've come to be with you. I'm your answer to your prayers. And they don't get it. And they are just confused. There's a huge purpose in going through this long chapter and all these points. And it isn't to say, wow, what a mixed up group of disciples these are. But this is us. This is our situation. We are like the disciples. We don't always see. We don't always hear. We think we've got it all. And then when the wind blows against us and it's late in the night, we get confused and we don't trust and we are afraid. And Jesus says, wait, it's me. And just because that doesn't mean they get it. They think I'm being unkind, maybe. I'm not. I hope I tell you this as clear as I can. I want to say this right here just as clear as I can. This is not discouraging. It sounds discouraging, doesn't it? Right? To think that the person next to you isn't any more alert than that. Well, that took a while. I was worried there for me. No, the fact is, I'm not always, I don't always see. I don't. And what I want to tell you is that Jesus doesn't get back out of the boat, walk away from these guys and say, I had it. These guys are hopeless. That does not happen. What happens? Now we come to the end, okay? Just because you worked all night and you had a promised retreat, you didn't get your retreat, you fed 5,000, took everything you had, you gave it to somebody else, you got back leftovers away, you got in the boat, you rowed all night, you were afraid, the wind was against you, the water was full, you cold, you went tired, terrified, thought the ghosts were coming to get you, but it turns out to be Jesus. You're really confused now because you don't get the whole thing. And then the boat scrapes against the shore of the far side, and you've had it. And you don't know yet that when you've seen Jesus, the worst day that you've had in your life, which was behind you, is about to turn into the best day of your life. The worst experiences that you've been through, all 8 of them that I just listed for you, change in a moment. And here's how it happens. They crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, wrong town, right? They missed the town they were going to. And they anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, the people what? Remember the word? What's the word for the day? Recognize him. Nobody else does. People tend. And they ran through the region. They carried the sick on the mats wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went into the villages and the towns and the countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplace. They begged him to let him touch even the edge of their cloak, and those who were touched were healed because they recognized him. Take courage, he says. He wasn't passing by them to leave them. He was going ahead of them. He was going to meet them there, because when they got there, he had something for them. And then you recognized he pushed you into the boat. It was the only way to get you to where you needed to go, because you wanted to sit around, watch TV. He prayed for you all night long. He saw you struggle. He knew about the wind, and he knew what you thought about the wind and the demons and the trouble and the danger and the water coming into the boat. You knew you were afraid, and the leftovers were rotten and wet by the time he got to the other side, because the water made him all wet. He cared about your struggling, and he knew all about that. And all of a sudden, he's there. And your goal was to reach the people on the other side, and they recognized him. They saw him for who he was, and they came running. And in that moment of fatigue and stress It's always been Jesus who made things work. It's only Jesus who draws a crowd. It's only Jesus that people want to see. It's only Jesus who heals the sick, raises the dead, and changes the course of history. We easily get mixed up because we don't see Jesus the way we want to see him. Sun shining softly on my back and the cottage and the wind. Everything perfect. But if you were with Jesus, it would be an all-night road, an all-night paddle. And when you got to the shore, there wouldn't be rest for you either, because when people recognize Jesus, they come running. He came to do whatever it gets to take us to turn away from our stuff and turn to him, so that we will, recognize him. Don't recognize him by things that go right. Recognize him because he puts us in the mess so that he can do his purpose among us. I don't know what God will do for us in the next year, but I imagine there will be a lot of rolling of food in the middle of the night. Be a lot of late night calls, a lot of grief, a lot of sorrow. But I recognize that at the end of the day, when I think my day couldn't be any worse, at the end of the day will be a new day, and it will still be Jesus' day, and it will be the day that people will come to him. He's watching, he's praying. He will arrive too late for me, but he will arrive right on time for his plans, because he wants people to recognize him when he gets there. Pray with me. Lord God, we have so much to do, such a big lake to row across as a church and as people. So many things before us, so many obstacles, so many waves. It feels like everything is lined up against us. But it is such a comfort to know that we don't have to know all that. We don't have to figure it all out. We don't have to recognize all the details. We don't need all the answers, because you're walking ahead of us. And at just the right moment, you'll open the door and people will see you and come running to you. I pray in Jesus' name that you will go with us in our hearts and our actions this day. In Jesus' name, amen.